On the evening of April 10th, 1991, the Moby Prince, an Italian passenger ferry, was departing the port of Livorno, Italy, headed for Olbia, Sardinia. The ferry was carrying 141 people, passengers, and crew on what should have been a routine overnight journey. At approximately 10:25 p.m., in thick fog, the Moby Prince collided with the MT Agip Abruzzo, an oil tanker anchored in the harbor. The collision ruptured the tanker's hull, spilling thousands of gallons of crude oil that immediately ignited. The Moby Prince was engulfed in a massive fireball within seconds. Trapped passengers and crew tried desperately to escape, but the flames spread too fast. When rescue ships finally reached the burning ferry hours later, they found a scene of horror. 140 people were dead, most killed by smoke inhalation or burns. Only one person survived, 26-year-old deckhand Alessio Bertrand, who was pulled from the water barely alive. This is the story of the Moby Prince disaster, Italy's worst peacetime maritime tragedy, and a disaster marked by catastrophic delays in rescue response. The Moby Prince. The Moby Prince was a roll-on/roll-off, ro-ro passenger ferry operated by Navama Lines. Built in 1968, the ship had been serving the Livorno-Olbia route for years, transporting passengers and vehicles between mainland Italy and Sardinia. The ferry was 132 meters, 433 feet long, and could carry approximately 500 passengers plus vehicles. Like most ferries of its type, it had passenger cabins, lounges, dining areas, and large vehicle decks for cars and trucks. On the evening of April 10th, 1991, the Moby Prince was preparing for a routine overnight crossing to Sardinia. April 10th, 1991, departure. The weather that evening was poor. Thick fog blanketed the port of Livorno, reducing visibility dramatically. Despite the fog, ferry operations were continuing, though conditions were hazardous. At approximately 10:03 p.m., the Moby Prince departed Livorno harbor with 141 people aboard, 65 passengers, including some truck drivers traveling with their vehicles, 76 crew members. The ferry was under the command of Captain Ugo Cessa, an experienced mariner. The plan was to make the overnight crossing to Olbia, arriving early the next morning. What no one aboard the Moby Prince knew was that disaster was waiting just outside the harbor. The MT Agip Abruzzo. The MT Agip Abruzzo was an oil tanker owned by the Italian oil company Agip. The tanker was anchored in the harbor approaches, waiting for berth space to unload its cargo of crude oil. The tanker's position was supposed to be clearly marked and known to harbor traffic. However, in the thick fog that night, visibility was extremely limited. The Agip Abruzzo was sitting at anchor, fully loaded with thousands of tons of crude oil, a massive stationary target that the Moby Prince was about to hit. The collision, 10:25 p.m. At approximately 10:25 p.m., just 22 minutes after departing the Moby Prince, traveling at cruising speed through the fog, collided with the anchored MT Agip Abruzzo. The ferry struck the tanker's starboard side with tremendous force. The impact ruptured the tanker's hull, released thousands of gallons of crude oil into the water. The oil immediately surrounded both vessels. Within seconds, the spilled oil ignited. The ignition source was likely sparks from the collision itself or from the ferry's engines. What happened next was catastrophic. A massive fireball erupted, engulfing the Moby Prince in flames. The inferno. The Moby Prince was instantly transformed into a floating inferno. The crude oil fire created flames hundreds of feet high, intense heat that melted metal and glass, thick, toxic black smoke that filled the ship's interior, a fire so hot that it could be seen for miles despite the fog. The ferry's passengers and crew were trapped. Many were in their cabins, relaxing or preparing for sleep. Others were in lounges or dining areas. When the fire erupted, they had seconds to react. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the ship. The ferry's superstructure, made largely of aluminum and other materials that burn or melt easily, offered little protection. Within minutes, most of the ship was ablaze. People tried desperately to escape. Some made it to open decks but were surrounded by flames. Others tried to reach lifeboats, but the fire had already consumed the boat deck. Some jumped into the oil-covered water, only to be burned by the flaming oil on the surface. Many were overcome by smoke before they could escape their cabins. The rescue response, catastrophic delays. Here's where the tragedy became even worse. The rescue response was catastrophically slow. The collision and fire occurred at 10:25 p.m., clearly visible from shore despite the fog. Yet, the first emergency calls weren't made until significantly later. Harbor authorities were slow to react. Rescue vessels took hours to reach the burning ferry. Firefighting ships struggled to approach because of the intense heat and flames. Coordination between different rescue agencies was poor. By the time rescue ships finally reached the Moby Prince, hours had passed. The fire had raged unchecked, consuming the ship and killing nearly everyone aboard. When rescuers finally boarded the smoldering wreck, they found a scene of absolute horror bodies throughout the ship, in cabins, in hallways, on decks. Many burned beyond recognition, the sole survivor. Of the 141 people aboard the Moby Prince, only one survived, Alessio Bertrand, a 26-year-old deckhand. Alessio was working on deck when the collision occurred. When the fire erupted, he was near the stern of the ship. He made a split-second decision that saved his life. He jumped into the water. Despite the flaming oil on the water's surface, despite the cold, despite his injuries, Alessio managed to swim away from the burning ship. He was in the water for hours before finally being rescued, barely alive, suffering from hypothermia, burns, and smoke inhalation. Alessio was the only person who could tell what happened aboard the Moby Prince in those final minutes. His testimony would prove crucial to understanding the disaster. The death toll. 140 people died in the Moby Prince disaster, 65 passengers, 75 crew members, including Captain Ugo Chesser. Most died from smoke inhalation. The toxic smoke from burning oil and ship materials killed quickly. Others died from burns or from drowning after jumping into the flaming water. The disaster became Italy's worst peacetime maritime tragedy, worse than the sinking of the Andrea Doria in 1956, which killed 46. The investigation. Multiple investigations were launched, and what they revealed was damning. Cause of the collision. The Moby Prince was traveling too fast in conditions of extremely limited visibility. The ferry should have slowed significantly or even stopped in the thick fog. The presence of the anchored tanker should have been known to the ferry's crew, but either the information wasn't communicated properly, or the crew failed to take it into account. Cause of the fire. The collision ruptured the tanker's hull, spilling crude oil. The oil ignited immediately, likely from sparks or hot surfaces from the collision, creating an instant inferno. Why so many died? 1. Speed of the fire. The crude oil fire spread almost instantaneously. 2. Ferry's construction. Materials used burned or melted easily. 3. Inadequate evacuation. Passengers and crew had no time to evacuate properly. 4. Smoke. Toxic smoke filled the ship within minutes, killing people before they could escape. The rescue response scandal. The investigations into the rescue response revealed shocking failures. Harbor authorities took far too long to coordinate rescue efforts. Firefighting vessels were slow to respond. Rescue ships struggled to approach the burning ferry effectively. Communication failures between agencies delayed response. Some witnesses claimed rescue ships could be seen in the distance, but didn't approach for hours. The slow rescue response became one of the most controversial aspects of the disaster. Many believed that if rescuers had reached the Moby Prince faster, more lives could have been saved. Legal proceedings. Multiple trials followed the disaster. Attempting to assign responsibility, ferry company officials were charged with various safety violations. Harbor officials were investigated for the slow rescue response. Questions were raised about whether the tanker's position was properly communicated. However, the legal proceedings were lengthy, contentious, and ultimately frustrating for victims' families. Many felt that justice was never fully served and that those responsible for the delays and failures were not adequately held accountable. The changes. The Moby Prince disaster led to some improvements in Italian maritime safety. Better coordination between harbor authorities and rescue services, improved communication systems for maritime emergencies, enhanced safety requirements for ferries, particularly regarding fire-resistant materials, greater awareness of the dangers of oil tankers anchored near ferry routes. However, many critics argue that the changes were insufficient given the scale of the tragedy. The controversy. The Moby Prince disaster remains controversial in Italy to this day. Several aspects continue to be debated. The slow rescue response. Why did it take so long for rescue ships to reach the burning ferry? Cover-up allegations. Some believe officials deliberately delayed rescue efforts or covered up failures. Accountability. Were the right people held responsible? Could more have been saved? If rescue had been faster, how many of the 140 might have survived? Victims' families have fought for decades for a full accounting of what happened and why the rescue response was so slow. Alessio Bertrand, the survivor. Alessio Bertrand, the sole survivor, carried enormous trauma from the disaster. He lost all his colleagues and friends in the fire. He spent years dealing with survivors' guilt, physical injuries, and psychological trauma. His testimony was crucial to understanding what happened aboard the Moby Prince in those final minutes. He described the sudden impact, the instant eruption of flames, the panic, the screams, and his desperate decision to jump into the water. Alessio's survival when 140 others died weighs heavily. Why him? Why not others? These are questions that have haunted him. Conclusion. On April 10th, 1991, the Moby Prince collided with an oil tanker in thick fog outside Livorno harbor. The collision ruptured the tanker, spilling crude oil that instantly ignited. The ferry was engulfed in a massive fireball. 140 people died, most from smoke inhalation, trapped aboard a burning ship. Only one person survived. The disaster was compounded by a catastrophically slow rescue response. Hours passed before rescue ships effectively reached the burning ferry, hours during which people may have been alive but unable to escape. The Moby Prince disaster is remembered as Italy's worst peacetime maritime tragedy. It's also remembered as a scandal, a disaster made worse by failures in coordination, communication, and rescue response. 140 people went on a routine ferry crossing and never arrived. They died in flames and smoke, many within sight of shore, while rescue ships delayed. Rest in peace to the 140 victims of the Moby Prince disaster. Your deaths exposed failures that should never have existed. May you never be forgotten. And may the questions about the slow rescue response be answered, so that the full truth of what happened that night is finally known.